Welcome to week 4 of Pub 502. This week we are talking about a couple of things, including organizational structure and culture. Now, what we'll soon find out in this lecture, and I think you found out from the readings, is that structure is important, but culture is probably paramount in these situations. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll be talking about, in particular, wicked problems and what they mean for public sector organizations and public sector management. So let's dive in. So one of the things that the Rainy chapter does really well that I wanted to make sure we capture here is a discussion of how to measure the dimensions of public organizations. Now, the rest of the Rainy chapter, I think, is fairly self-explanatory, so you won't see a whole lot of it in here. Instead, we're going to focus on the wicked problems. But I think kind of boxing things into these four dimensions helps understand them a little bit better. And why this matters, other than just it will come up again when you do your video submission this week. So that's certainly one reason. But another reason why it matters is because centralization, formalization, bureaucratization, or red tape, and complexity, we have some control over some of this, and sometimes we don't have control over other parts of it. So understanding when you have control and what that might lead to can be important. So when we start talking about wicked problems and how they become intractable, some of it might relate back to the fact that you have a very centralized or decentralized organization, and so problem solving cannot happen in the way you would want it to. So the first of these boxes is centralization, and that is the degree to which power and authority are concentrated at higher levels. Is your organization one where the directives are given at the top and followed at the bottom, or is there some a feedback loop maybe in between levels to better understand the work of the organization? And the key issue here is, where is the location of decision making? The next is formalization, and that is the extent to which an organization's structures are formally established via written rules or regulations. Now, this will differ from organization to organization, and every organization has some established written rules and regulations. None of the organizations we're talking about are just kind of fly-by-night operations or just coming into existence without any sort of written background. At the very least, if we're talking about a very nascent nonprofit organization, they're still going to have a mission statement. They're still going to have some form of funding documentation. So there is some formalization kind of across the board. It's just what it looks like. The existence of, and maybe the existence of, greater numbers of rules, manuals, regulations, organizational charts, or other formal instructions are a good measure of how formalized a workplace is. Next, we have the issue of red tape or bureaucracy, and if you really want a tongue twister, you can call this bureaucratization. I choose not to. And this is the type of administrative rules and regulations that exist even doing daily work. And so you can think of this in the negative sense, which red tape is kind of the negative sense of this, which is how difficult is it to do the daily tasks without running into bureaucratic roadblocks. So red tape can be burdensome. But I will say that red tape exists for a reason. A lot of times these processes exist to ensure that people are treated equally across the board. And so a certain level of redundancy is not necessarily a bad thing. But it is one way in which we can measure the dimensions of a public organization. For example, if you run the Secretary of State's office, if you even just run a branch office, the amount of red tape you have to deal with on a daily basis will affect not just the work you do and how you process paperwork, but how you deal with customers, especially customers who become irate because they have to deal with the red tape and the paperwork. So that's certainly a measure as well. And then finally, complexity. What are the number of subunits, levels, and specializations? If you look at an organizational chart, there are a couple of ways to measure this. The first is horizontal differentiation. How Many, if you are looking from right to left or left to right. How many specialized division of labor units are there across the organization? How many different branches of that organizational tree exist? And one of the ways in which you can kind of visualize this is to look up the organizational charts of the University of Michigan Flint. There is a way to kind of view a large institution, but not an overwhelming one, and see how much differentiation there is across units. And that's horizontal differentiation. Of course, there's also vertical differentiation, and that is the number of hierarchical levels in an organization that exist. And the more vertical differentiation, this might mean that the more communication needs to be free and clear between these levels to ensure problems are being solved and maybe even headed off at the pass. So next we are going to talk about wicked problems, and we're going to actually spend the bulk of our time talking about wicked problems today. That is the densest of our articles, and I think it's probably the most important to spend our time on in this video lecture. Wicked problems, the article by Head and Elford, are problems that are complex, unpredictable, open-ended, or intractable. We are discussing these problems because they tend to frequently haunt public organizations, or maybe they appear to. There are different degrees of wickedness, as we'll talk about, and while conclusive solutions are rare, there can be partial solutions, and there can be provisional solutions that at least tide us over. So how the structures and processes of public policy and management exist can serve to complicate the task of understanding wicked problems and moving towards solutions. So when we talk about management broadly, if you were going to go take a just basic management class at a business school, what you are going to find out is that there are a lot of systems that are technical techniques of problem solving, of management, that are kind of run as almost scientific in a way. The problem with applying these methods of management to public organizations is that systems of problems exist and social problems are not subject to the same rules as other problems. Maximizing value for shareholders in a monetary sense is not the same type of problem as it is as maximizing value or meeting the concerns of stakeholders. And in fact, society has changed. And the more heterogeneity that exists, the more that technical solutions are impossible or unlikely to solve these wicked problems. So the reading talks about these 10 primary characteristics of wicked problems that Rattel and Weber give us. It's a 1973 article, but it's cited heavily in the Head and Elford article. I'm not going to go over all of them. They're certainly listed there, but I think maybe the first one is probably the crux of the issue here. And that is there is no definitive formulation of a wicked problem. And once you go down to 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, you understand that they don't have a set of potential solutions. It's not like every wicked problem can be served by 8 possible solutions. They are all essentially unique and time-bound and maybe never will happen again, so you can only learn so much from them. And every wicked problem can be considered a symptom of another problem. So if you think about it in terms of a food bank's existence, their wicked problems are much deeper than just the existence of a food bank and how they provide their services, because the wicked problem that exists in the first place is societal hunger and food scarcity. So the existence of a wicked problem can be described in multiple ways, and there will usually be multiple attempts at solving it or framing the problem that exists. And one of the reasons that wicked problems are so challenging is that they are intrinsically linked to debates about the scope and role of government. If you believe that government has a role in alleviating hunger, the existence of a food bank will have a different role to play in working with government agencies. Wicked problems tend to arise in relation to environmental crises, hurricanes, wildfires, and we could certainly add the Flint water crisis to this. But they can also come up in routine matters. So if you think about how we process social welfare programs and benefits, how we deal with poverty and crime on a day to day basis at the frontline level, what do we do? That is intrinsically linked to a wicked problem. So, wicked problems may not be solved, right? They may not be solved in our lifetime and they may not be solved at all. And the best we can do sometimes is to deal with them. And so, more often than not, dealing with them is just as important, if not the most important thing. So, Heifetz's typology of problems serves to be at least somewhat useful here because it breaks down the problem into concrete sections. At the one end of the spectrum, we have right here type 1 problems. We have a clear definition, a clear solution, and what exists is the technical work that needs to get done, right? The problem is that the weeds are overgrowing in the city park. The solution is we need to redirect resources to cutting those weeds down from the Parks and Rec department, and the technical work that needs to be done is just merely finding time to do that. I'm saying merely, and I know already that some of you are thinking about probably issues in your own localities where this has come up. And certainly having weather issues like Michigan does, this comes up a lot. The definition is clear, right? We know the public parks are overgrown. The solution is clear. We know that they need to be mowed and weeded and that type of thing. The technical work is what needs to get done, but still, the problem may exist because you can't get it done. The ground is too wet. You can't get the equipment on the ground to efficiently do the work, and so you have to wait. It's a tame problem, though, in comparison to some other wicked problems. So classifying them as tame is not to say that they are not important, and it is not to say that they are not contentious. But at the end of the day, the definition of the problem is clear, and the solution is clear, and the technical work is what needs to get done. A type 2 problem can be a wicked problem, but not necessarily is. Here, the definition of the problem is clear, but the solution is unclear, typically because it's hard to discern cause and effect. And so there is a certain amount of learning and discussion required by both government leaders and stakeholders to find out what the solution should be and what types of solutions maybe have been tried before, or what solutions are at least possible, right? So I will give an example from my own municipality, since we're dealing with municipalities, it seems like, in this set. There is a problem with oversight of the municipal animal shelter. Many localities have gone to at least farming this job out to the county or employing a volunteer staff. And where I live, we've kind of existed in some sort of limbo for an indefinite period of time, where we've defunded a lot of the shelter activities and housed the shelter under the police department, which is really, in my opinion, not an ideal place to put it for a variety of reasons. So the definition is clear because the work is not getting done. We know animals are staying there too long that are easily adoptable animals, as those things tend to go, easily adoptable in quotes maybe. But the solution is unclear because maybe financial resources don't exist. Or there might be some who believe that the work of a city shelter is just to reunite animals with their owners, and after a certain holding period, those animals should go to the county level. So there might be a wicked problem here, and the wicked problem might be, should we have an animal shelter that is involved in the adoption of animals that have been left unclaimed for a certain period of time at all, or should that be sent to another entity to deal with? Is that the role of local government? So there needs to be a discussion to determine what the solution is. The definition of the problem is clear. The shelter is overworked. It's kind of overrun with just day-to-day management problems. and the funding needed to run an efficient shelter of that size may not be available from the city. So the solution is unclear. So maybe a wicked problem because you might not believe that this is something government should be doing. It might be a tamer problem because we all kind of agree that it needs to exist, but we don't agree with what should be done about it. And then there's these type 3 problems. These are your classic wicked problems. The definition is unclear, the solution is unclear, and there is going to be an extensive amount of learning and discussion required for all of those involved. And if we're going to stick with my same municipality, one of the problems that exists is how to keep people in the downtown area that aren't just there for drinking and eating at restaurants, but also there to do shopping and maybe some other activities as well, right? This is a kind of prototypical downtown development problem. Flint has a similar problem, although I would say they're dealing with it a little bit better than where I live. Where for a long time what existed were food and bar establishments and little else in terms of activities or shopping. And so how do you get people to become invested in the community? Well, the definition of the problem is unclear, right? Because is that an actual problem? Do we need a downtown that has certain types of amenities, or should it maybe be a limited downtown that exists just for those kind of daytime workers and a few stragglers after the fact? So the definition of the problem is a little bit unclear. The solution is certainly unclear. Is it a solution that would benefit from additional parking, additional startup funding for certain types of businesses, or maybe just highlighting the businesses that are there? Or is it something more than just a business solution? Do we need more activities? Do we need more diverse stakeholders in the downtown area? So providing more knowledge is helpful, but it's not going to solve the problem. I can bring experts on downtown development every day of the week to a city council facing this problem. But the fact of the matter is, until the city council actually defines what they feel the problem is, or a city commission, or a county commission, or any of these things, until they define what they feel the problem is, they are not going to be able to implement those solutions that have been tried elsewhere in areas where they have similarly defined problems and similarly defined resources. So there is an extensive amount of learning and discussion that's required for all involved. And that doesn't start just with the solution. It starts with the definition of the problem. And whether you believe that government should be involved in that type of thing at all is going to be kind of the crux of the issue underlying everybody's ideology about this problem. So just providing more knowledge is not enough. So how do you manage wicked problems, right? We know they exist. Great. How in the heck do we deal with them? We don't have a set, surefire way to say these are the 8 steps you take, and once you do that, all your wicked problems will go away. If we did, we probably wouldn't have this class, and certainly we would have a very different looking public governance system. But there are at least 3 ways that this article outlines that we can also draw on other resources as well, that we can kind of think of 3 buckets of ways in which we can at least prepare ourselves to better deal with wicked problems. The first is to broaden the way in which we think about problems, the variables involved, options that may exist, and linkages to other problems. So the reading gives a discussion of something called frame reflection, that intractable disputes are likely caused by or furthered by different frames and value perspectives about the problem. So instead of arguing, for example, and we're going to broaden this out a little bit, instead of arguing about the scientific validity of vaccines, which if you have encountered someone who believes that there is not scientific validity in certain or maybe all vaccines, you can present article after peer-reviewed research, after experts, and it's not going to change people's discussion. or people's beliefs in the discussion. And your beliefs aren't being changed either. And so when there is a public health crisis, like a measles outbreak or something of the like, that's not going to help come to a solution. You may be right, but that doesn't solve the problem. Being right, I should have this tattooed somewhere, does not solve the problem. Sadly, you need to do something more. So scientific reports are not going to save you. They're not going to solve the problem. What you need to do here is actually address the value propositions involved, or at least create a shared understanding, what the reading calls a metaframe, but I will call a shared understanding that builds on those conflicting frames, and potentially even involving people that you disagree with. And it allows people to work through implications of beliefs in a more coherent approach. And so the vaccine debate can still rage on, but you can talk about, okay, if you have an active outbreak of a certain disease, what are ways in which you can deal with those things that are at least above and beyond, or maybe tangential to just increasing vaccine rates, right? Because at the end of the day, there are certain people, unfortunately, in my opinion, that you're not going to be able to reach with that message. And so what can you do to protect the medically vulnerable in the moment when you are dealing with a public health crisis? And some of that might be quarantining, some of that might be limiting the activities of people who do not have vaccines. But see how we're building a meta frame that is harder to contest than the actual underlying problem itself. So broadening the scope of the conflict actually helps here. Another tactic is systems thinking. Attempts to overcome mechanistic and linear metaphors, saying, I send out the commands and you control, tend to be common in organizations. And accepting a more holistic approach might help you solve problems, right? It considers that processes outside of the organization exist, and you have to actually consider them as a more complex web of inputs, processes, and outputs than just kind of what you do on the daily basis. So this might be understanding that processing vaccine waivers, for example, is a matter of paperwork, but has more of a complex history than maybe the paperwork would lead you to understand. And then finally, complexity theory. It might actually be helpful to draw attention to some of the chaotic and contradictory aspects of policy in various settings. It might be an actual benefit to show interdependence feedback loops, even to people who disagree with you, because you have to aid in tracking these complex trends and challenges just as much as you need to aid in finding solutions. So if you are going to kind of go in and complexify a problem, what you are going to do is show a broader scope and also a more detailed scope, because that might actually help you get to some root solutions that might not exist otherwise. And involving more people in that can be a good thing. So the second broad category or bucket is new models of leadership. And I'm going to highlight kind of two things of this. First is that there is this thing that the reading calls collaborative advantage, and this can exist in three ways. First, when you are collaborating or cooperating with other organizations and entities, those networks increase the likelihood that the problem can be better understood. So just by including more people at the table, you can increase the likelihood of understanding the problem. The second is that you might find provisional solutions that work in the moment, which help you get on to the next moment. And then finally, it facilitates implementation of solutions because there is more buy-in into the construction of the problem and the solution itself. Collaboration also has two other advantages in studying the problem, or studying wicked problems more broadly. When you have more points of connection through regular communication with other organizations, maybe you set up a monthly collaborative of people who are working on hunger in the Flint area, rather than just focusing on the food bank, for example. When you have more points of connection, you actually might find symptoms of wicked problems in new places that you can stop in their tracks. So if you determine that people, if they could make it to the farmer's market, would have greater access to fresh food, maybe you can redirect resources to transportation to or from the farmer's market, or maybe delivery of food to or from the farmer's market. Next, collaboration can also lead to an increased degree of mutual trust and commitment, so that when vulnerabilities are shown, you actually trust in that other entity, so that when solutions arise, they might actually be able and more willing to engage in the solution process itself. And then finally, this third bucket, that there are better ways of management that can support these processes. And this is really about leadership here. So, three main approaches to leadership roles that they talk about, and some are more used in business schools than others. One is the transformational leadership, or leader as hero. In other words, a hero leader has two roles. One, to set out the frame and the vision of what the organization is going to do, and then get others to do that work. But wicked problems don't fall easily into solutions in that type of environment, because they're not visible to one person, and certainly the solutions are not capable of being either visible to or dealt with one person alone. So maybe something like adaptive leadership, where the leader just doesn't announce the strategy and expects compliance, but rather views themselves as leading organizational members and or stakeholders in undertaking the collective work together. So the leader's task here in adaptive leadership is to provide the environment or the circumstances for the work to get done without kind of coming in and dictating what needs to be done. That is a very delicate line because there are times when work needs to get done and someone needs to say, hey, you know, it's fine to broadcast problems and solutions around this area, but at the same time, we have day-to-day business operations that need to happen. So this is difficult. You want people to examine uncomfortable issues. You don't want to stress them out too much, and you also want to get them to do the daily work of the organization. So the role of the leader in this circumstance is to identify the challenge, keep stress in check, and protect the voices of leadership, and also just to protect the voices engaged in the process. And then finally, the reading outlines collaborative leadership as a potential. This is leading in a shared powered world, which can encompass a range of perspectives united in their interaction between kind of collaboration and leadership. So this entails leading without kind of having any of the formal mechanisms of leadership that we tend to think about. The ability to fire and hire, the ability to give raises. And to be honest with you, this has to be, in many cases, the role of the public manager, because the resources just do not exist to engage in anything but collaborative leadership, where your hands are somewhat tied by other factors. Maybe that's civil service rules, maybe that's a lack of a budget to incentivize. The powers need to be handled carefully, because what your powers include here are determining who's in the collaboration, how to frame the issue, how to create the agenda, and so on. To make all of these things work, you need flexible organizational structures. You need things that the public service world is not good about giving, which is flexible budgeting and financing mechanisms and flexible performance management systems. So wicked problems continue to exist in many ways, not just because they're large social problems and they're hard to get to the root of. That's all true. But in many ways they exist because the flexibility needed in the public sector is hard to come by. And it's those innovators that find it and run with it that tend to find solutions to these problems. We do have a couple of other readings this week. The first of them is this organizational culture article, the PAR article. Talks about the benefits of a vibrant culture, what you need for the building blocks. What I wanted to focus on were some of the examples it gives or alludes to, um, or maybe some that I've thrown in myself. So Zappos, I believe, is one that is in the article. I've also read about it other places as well, so I tend to forget exactly where I've learned which part. But the biggest part of this is that their first point of contact with new employees is what they call a cultural fit interview. And in fact, they offer people $2,000 to quit after the first week of training if they decide the job isn't for them. And that's a really different way of thinking about the world. Imagine if you offered employees $2,000 to quit after that first week. Those, though, that choose to stay are more likely to engage in what they have framed as their 10 core values. There are skill tests involved and capability needs that they have, but they have a portion of their budget dedicated to team building and culture promotion so that when they find talent that is dedicated to the mission, they retain it. Southwest also has kind of a dedicated employee base. They tend to bring employees on board as part of their mission, and it's not just the commercials you see where they highlight them, but it's the way in which they engage them in the stakeholder process more largely. And one of the ways in which they do this is they give their employees permission, and this might sound familiar to those of you who have been to Disney World, to kind of give them permission to let them go the extra mile. If you go to Disney, they call it they call it some magical thing, allowing magical things to happen. Why I'm blanking on this, I don't know. But being able to do your job in kind of this way in which you see instant gratification from customers allows employees, even on a bad day, to find something to look forward to. A couple of the other stories here, REI is more of a co-op. They know that employees can work anywhere, but that they submit to work at REI because they actually like the work that they do. They also have regular town hall style meetings where they can submit questions, and they are immersed in that culture. And then finally, Costco tends to be one of those places where people tend to stay, and part of it is just a higher pay structure than competitors, but part of it is actually providing room for advancement and growth and some job security that other places don't have. Now, all of these are for-profit examples, but that doesn't mean that they can't be drawn upon to think about what is it that you want to see in your employees and how do you want to empower them to do the work of the organization. So putting it all together, if you kind of were to come away with your key takeaways, first, public organizations are often home of the most wicked problems. Those are hard to solve. But you can set yourself up for better success through leadership and culture. And you have to cultivate what you can, where you can, given your constraints and resources. The second, organizational culture makes the job or may break the job for some people. That not being allowed to actually seek out solutions, but only to do the day-to-day grunt work, those types of things might actually drive people away. And three, and this comes mostly from the Parr and Harris articles, stopping a pattern of behavior and burnout may take intervention, and relatively small things may mean big changes in the outcome. That's all for this week. I look forward to seeing what you have going on in the notes. It's been fun reading those so far, and I think you guys are really having a good conversation over there. So that's it for now.